Hey there, welcome back to my channel. Today we are talking about how to forgive your parents. I wanted to make this episode because it is the time of year where if people did not have a good relationship with their parents or their family, it can bring up a lot of emotions. But in general, if you're doing any kind of self-development work, you are always going to come up against the mother and the father complex. You're going to come up against your past conditioning. You're going to come up against your parents' conditioning. And part of becoming free of your patterns and becoming free of your conditioning is really seeing how it originated in your parents. And I've seen it go a couple different ways. Sometimes people that have had difficult childhoods will really downplay it because that was part of the strategy as they were growing up. As a child, it's hard to admit, like, my parents aren't taking care of me in the way that I need to be taken care of. I'm being neglected, I'm being abused. Like, sometimes that's hard for people to admit even later in life. I've seen it time and time again where people will come to me in my coaching containers and I'll hear about their childhood, which sounds incredibly difficult and emotional and traumatic, and they just kind of wash right by it like, oh, it was fine. You know, they didn't beat us until we blacked out or anything. And I think especially people that didn't have any capital T trauma from their parents, even if their parents were incredibly emotionally abusive or neglectful, you will always get the, well, like, we were fed and we had everything that we needed and they put a roof over our head. And essentially you adapt to be like, well, because my basic needs were met, I had a good childhood. So sometimes there comes a part in the journey where you really have to acknowledge that some of the things that happened in your childhood were not okay and actually feel the feelings that you repressed back then. Then there's this other side of it where people know full well, my parents were bad parents. They neglected us. They abused us. They suck. And this can turn into rumination. It can turn into like victim complex, like everything that's wrong with me is because of my parents, which also sometimes, like I said, this realization and these feelings do need to come out, even if they feel very uncomfortable. But the problem is when you linger in it too long. Essentially, you're not moving on and you're still letting your parents influence the way you show up in the world. Either way, it's really important to understand, what was my parents' conditioning? How did it affect me? What did I adopt as a result? And how can I free myself from the template of my parents? This is a huge part of the individuation journey. It's the work that I do with a lot of my clients where we work on the inner mother and the inner father archetype. And you really have to build connection with these archetypes internally in order to cut the cords from your parents' energy. Because whether it be you're still in a state where you really want your parents' approval, or the things that they say are incredibly triggering to you, you're having an emotional reaction to the way that your parents perceive you or the world. You have to understand you're coming from a child's place at that point. You're projecting things onto your parents on what you wish they would be. And the goal with this work around your parents is to free yourself from the baby place, essentially, where you are looking to them for something. So whether you've just been triggered by your family during the holidays and some wheels are spinning around ways that your family has been problematic to you or that your parents have been problematic to you, or you've been on this journey for a while and you're holding resentment towards your parents, let's talk about, how do you forgive your parents? First things first, you have to take responsibility for your own feelings and your own emotions. So if you are in a place where you're incredibly triggered by your parents, you really can't be around them, it's a problem, then it's okay to go no contact. It's okay to withdraw your energy and go inwards and do the work and not have the external irritants really worsening the wound. Sometimes we have to go inward and we have to triage and we have to take care of our emotional needs and safety first. That is also part of doing this work, is how do you reparent the parts of you that you feel like didn't get the love, attention, or care in your childhood, and how can you show up for yourself? And sometimes this does look like taking a step away, going no contact, maybe putting more space between you and your parents could be a strategy to gain some perspective. I think sometimes when people start doing like inner child work, or they start looking at the ways that their parents had perhaps wronged them in their life, there's this desire to like go to the parents and say, you really did this to me and I need you to apologize, or I need validation from this. while you can do that and you might have a good conversation with your parents, the expectation that you're going to get a resolution out of it still puts you in the baby place, still puts you in the child space, where you're looking externally to your parents for validation versus fortifying the parental energy within you to be able to take care of these more vulnerable pieces of yourself. Have the conversation with your parents if you think it would be helpful to them, or maybe if you do want to express and just get it off of your chest, but never go into these conversations with your parents with the expectation that they are going to rewrite a wrong that had happened in your childhood. It's actually really hard to be a parent, and there's lots of things that parents will really beat themselves up on things that they perhaps did wrong, or they'll completely deny that they did those things wrong because of lots of unconscious shame. So I've seen this happen where people go to talk to their parents about this event or this thing or this experience that they had when they were children, and the parent goes, "What the hell are you talking about?" They have a completely different reality, a completely different perception on what happened. And this is part of the work. It's understanding that your perception of the experience and your parents' perception of the experience might be completely different, and that is okay. This is part of separating from your parents, individuating from your parents, is understanding that they have their own reality and you have yours, and that's okay. But trying to get them to understand, trying to get them to apologize, trying to get them to grovel for whatever they did to you or whatever you perceive they did to you definitely, again, puts you back in a place where you're not in power. And we get our power back by taking radical responsibility for our emotions. I love that there's this saying, it's like, it's not your fault what happened to you, but it is your responsibility to deal with it. And trying to replay the loop again with your parents where somehow it comes out okay on the other end, like that is a very rare occurrence, and definitely don't depend on it. Especially if you're still in an emotional state where you're like, oh my gosh, like they did this to me, and you're not coming at it with like a loving, open dialogue, and you're going in with like resentment or blame. People will unconsciously feel that and they will revolt against you. I had conversations with my parents way after I did like the primary work and was able to have some more open conversations with my parents about things that had happened in my youth, where we had very different perspectives of what happened. And it ended up being a healing conversation. But I know for a fact if I would have brought it up when I was in a state of being triggered or in a state of still feeling upset about it, that conversation would have gone really poorly. So I don't want to say there can't be resolution with your parents, you can't talk to your parents. Like sometimes you can, just wait until you're in a state emotionally where you are secure within yourself. So how do you get in touch with your inner mother and father archetype? It's understanding that creator, the universe, God, whatever word you want to use, has both a masculine and a feminine side, and it's very archetypal, the great mother and the great father. It's getting in touch with this powerful energy that you can access within you. Now, in the work that I do with clients, we tend to work a lot first on the shadow of the mother and father from your conditioning, because sometimes we really need to clean that up first before you can truly connect with pure mother and father spiritual energy, I'll call it, because there'll be a lot of projections sometimes of your own parental influences onto these structures. Another thing to do though is just think about, how would I want to embody the archetype for my inner child? Inner child work is incredibly important for ultimately forgiving your parents, because you are showing up to care for the vulnerable parts of yourself versus letting that wound or letting that pain kind of sit unattended, festering, and directed towards your parents. You take it inwards, you take that power back so that you can embody the mother or the father that your inner child needed. So I do suggest, if you haven't done inner child work, to do that. I feel like men in particular usually skip over this. To me, it's fundamental spiritual work, is to get in touch with your inner child, to get in touch with your inner vulnerability. So if you haven't done this, build a little practice around it. First thing in the morning, just connect, tap in to a safe place, visualize a safe place, a place that you really liked as a child perhaps, and call in the image of you as a child and really connect with them. Ask them how they're feeling, ask them what they want, ask them if there's anything that you can do for them. Inner child work is very beautiful because it does remind you areas in your life where you're not playing, where you're not having fun, where there is lack of joy. You'll start to see parts of yourself that are afraid to show up because of your childhood conditioning. It's baseline work. If you haven't done it, start inner child work. I also help people get started on this in my coaching containers. But you can never forgive your parents unless you can parent yourself well. Otherwise, you're always going to be looking at that external example and saying, like, there are these parts of me that are neglected and it's your fault. Take the power back, become your own parents, do the work with your inner child. I'll mention again, shadow work, especially shadow when it comes down to your mother and your father and what their persona was, who they showed up in the world as, and understanding what parts of their personality did I adopt or reject, and in what ways am I not standing in my truth because I'm only accepting or rejecting these qualities of my parents. Like, how deeply am I still in the blueprint of my parents' personality? And you do this through shadow work exercises, self-inquiry. It's sometimes tough to do on your own. This is what I always say, like, get a shadow work coach, because our ego will set up defenses and blind spots on purpose so that you don't see what's unseen, so you don't see the shadow. But you have to do a lot of shadow work around your conditioning and how that's connected to your parent. And what's interesting is when you start to do deep work around this, something shifts in the way that you view your parents. Fundamentally, because you start to see that your parents are also just a product of their conditioning. You start to see them in more of a human light versus you're here to provide things for me and your sole existence is my parent. And it's because as humans, our parents are the ones who are taking care of us, responsible for us, ushering us into the world and all of these things. And so we'll keep that imprint of them for quite some time. After you do enough shadow work, it starts to dissipate and you really do start to see your parents as people. And this is a process. So I'm not trying to downplay if you're really pissed off at your parents right now, honor that, feel through that, know why you feel it, because that is the energy that you're going to need in order to come back and reparent yourself. But know that the end game is to get to this place of neutrality, to get to this place of detachment. Anyways, if you're in a place where you are very triggered by your parents or even other family members, or this just came up during the holiday season, I would love to help you do shadow work around this. It's the most important part of your shadow work journey, is really getting to the root of the conditioning from your parents and freeing yourself of the ties and the bonds to your parents and to their conditioning. Because again, even if you are completely rejecting everything about them and who they are, you are still using that template. You're either totally accepting it or totally rejecting it, but you're still working with it, which means you are not operating from an individuated true self state. If going deeper in this work is interesting to you, I offer free one-on-one alignment sessions to connect to see if one of my coaching containers is a fit for you. And if you're someone with particularly difficult parents and you have any tips, tricks, feedback about this that you would like to comment on, please, if you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment. If you're listening to it on a podcast, feel free to shoot me an email. I would love to hear from you. Other than that, thank you so much for being here, guys, and I'll see you next time.